Hey everybody, Dyer here. Doing something today that's a little different, which is why I'm uploading it to my own channel instead of Dyer and Betty. This really isn't on brand for the Dyer and Betty channel because that's all about video games, and, well, today I want to talk a little bit about music. Specifically, this is kind of a video response to a video that a friend of mine put together. His YouTube channel is Average Joe Vinyl, which I'll go ahead and link to in the description. But the question that was posed was, what are the 10 albums that you've listened to the most in your life? That took a lot of thought. You see, there's plenty of albums I've listened to, more than the ones that are going to be on this list. But if I was to list those albums, this would be a list of nothing but Rush, Fear Factory, Alice in Chains, and Weird Al Yankovic. And that would get kind of boring pretty quick. So I really thought about it, and going all the way back to my childhood, I'd say these are the 10 albums I've listened to the most in my life, and that I actually still listen to this day. So, without further ado, let's get started. First up is number 10, the Transformers the Movie Original Motion Picture Soundtrack. Yeah, there might be some nostalgia at play here. I was a huge Transformers fan growing up. The movie is still something I can watch to this day and enjoy. And you might say, well, you know, nostalgia is driving you here. But no, I still listen to this album. I'm not a huge fan of 80s hair metal. But the bands that are on here, well, I really like their songs. Probably because of association with the movie, but then again, Weird Al Yankovic's on here too, and, well, I didn't associate him with the movie. And for that matter, Vince Nicola had actually contributed a couple of songs to the soundtrack from the movie score. And his stuff's pretty good. So, there's going to be a couple of soundtracks on this list, just so you know. In fact, the next one, number 9, is Back to the Future. Music from the motion picture soundtrack. And as you can see right there, featuring The Power of Love by Huey Lewis and the News. Yeah, everyone knows that. And again, it got a lot of nostalgia for Back to the Future. It's one of my top 3 favorite movies. And the soundtrack is something I've always come to associate with the film. You know, you've got a couple of songs by Huey on there. You've got songs from Lindsey Buckingham, from Eric Clapton, and that's just the first half of the album. On the second half is all 50 songs, which probably would never listen to on my own, but they were part of the soundtrack, and they did grow on me. Turns out at least one of them was a favorite of my mother's, which was The Wallflower. And of course, there is a couple of pieces of music from the score by Alan Silvestri on here too, including the Back to the Future theme. So, yeah, still listen to this one. And the big one for me would be the one that's coming in at number 8, which is the John Williams and the London Symphony Orchestra score for Raiders of the Lost Ark. This soundtrack, for years, I spent trying to track down. I had it on cassette, but honestly, I think I wore the cassette out. So when I started getting into CDs in the early 90s, I made it a point to go look for this soundtrack, but could not find it anywhere. And turns out, the reason for that is because it had only been released in Japan. So I spent years and years searching for it. I actually found a place that carried the imported soundtrack for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but that wasn't Raiders. I bought it anyway. And then sometime in the mid-90s, my friend Jason, also a big Indiana Jones fan, had let me know that he was at Best Buy, that it only recently opened up at that point. It was down in Altamont Springs, Florida. And he let me know that he had found the Raiders soundtrack on CD there, and he bought a copy. So the next time I went, I spent a lot more money on music back then. So I went in with enough to buy 4 CDs. But the first thing I did was head over to the soundtrack section to see if they did actually have a copy. And sure enough, there it was. And I don't think I let go of that until I put it on the cash register. I was with a few friends of mine that day, including my friends Lars, Patrick, and Dave. And Dave he knew about my search for the soundtrack, because every time we'd go to a music store, we'd stop in and I'd look for it. So it got to be a running joke. And that day I walked up to him. I didn't say a word. I just whipped up the soundtrack and held it in front of his face. And his reaction was, he just kind of got really open mouthed for a second. Then he was like, "Oh my God, he found it." Still have that to this day, even though there's been other releases that have come out that have been expanded. In fact, there was one released about a year later which had 10 extra tracks on it and was an official US release. So, but yeah, definitely one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite, film score of all time. So, still have the cassette too. I haven't played it in years. But we're finally getting out of soundtracks now. We're moving on to number 7, a childhood staple. Huey Lewis and the News Sports. You know, I was at the right age when Huey really blew up. So, seeing the videos for stuff like, I think Heart and Soul and Heart of Rock and Roll. Didn't have MTV at the time, but we did have a TV show that aired on Friday night called Friday Night Videos. So all you see those there, and I really liked what I heard, so I eventually got a copy of it on cassette. And it was, I think, the first actual album by an artist that I bought instead. That wasn't just a soundtrack. Because most of the releases I had in the 80s were soundtracks, Ghostbusters, Star Wars, and all that other stuff. But this was the first actual album I had, and it's one I can still listen to pretty much all the way through, although I have a tendency to skip the last track. It's I forget exactly what it is. I know it's a country cover. Honky Tonk Blues. Not a favorite of mine, but it's alright. Now, in the early 90s is when I really started to develop my taste in music. And there were certain bands that helped solidify that. Among them, the aforementioned Rush, Fear Factory, and Alice in Chains. One band, though, that I was introduced to was the band Type O Negative through their album Bloody Kisses. And I started following them, and, well, they had some great stuff. The one that I came to really listen to all the time was the one that comes in at number 6 on this list, which is their album Life Is Killing Me. Now, a lot of this comes from when I was in the process of separating from my now ex-wife, and there was a lot of songs on this which really stuck out to me, but overall, the whole album, I felt it was just a distillation of everything they'd worked on at the time. And it's still one that's in heavy rotation with me to this day. In fact, I'd say that probably my favorite Type O song of all time is on this album, which is Todd's Ship Gods, Above All Things. But the final 2 tracks in the album, too, not including the little filler track that comes between them. I think it's Anesthesia and The Dream Is Dead. I think those are the titles. I don't have a list in front of me at the moment, but yeah. So, kind of connected to a bad time in my life, but it's still just an album I can't stop listening to. So, from here, let's go back a little bit to the mid-90s with the album that comes in at number 5 on my list, which is Empty by God Lives Underwater. They were a band I just happened to hear I think their only major hit. They had a couple after that, but this was the first one that really, connected with people. A song called No More Love. Happened to hear that on the way to Best Buy one day. And good song. I didn't have any money that day, so I didn't buy the CD, but my friend Bromley had come back from leave. He'd come back on leave. He was in the Navy at the time. And he had a copy of the album, so I got to listen to it. And I was really impressed. So I made it a point to pick this one up next. And it was completely solid all the way through. And kind of made me think of a cross between Alice in Chains and Nine Inch Nails in a way, although not quite as heavy as either. They were a band that had a lot of potential, but just never really made the big time. Did get to see them at a free concert at the Daytona Band Shell back in the late 90s. Met their lead singer, David Riley, after that. Really nice guy. Turns out if we'd stuck around instead of leaving the way we did, we could have all gone down to one of the local bars, because apparently he went in there and bought beers for everybody. And if I remember correctly, he passed away in 2003, which is pretty sad. I don't even think their last album was released until after that. But this one's good for, No More Love's on here, the title track, the song 23, which is elsewhere on my channel, and the song Tortoise. And unless I'm mistaken, I think that one showed up in the Johnny Mnemonic soundtrack, if anyone remembers that movie. But going back just a little bit before that would have been the album that made number 4 on my list, which is Dream Theater's Images and Words. To this day, this still has my favorite Dream Theater song of all time on it. Not that the album would have changed or anything like that, but the song Metropolis Part 1, The Miracle and the Sleeper. And that's such a great track. I'm glad they blew it out into a full album for the sequel. But there's so many good songs on this album. Pull Me Under, the opening track, was the biggest hit they had, which they jokingly referenced in their Greatest Hits album, or I think it was called Greatest Hit, plus a bunch of other really cool songs or something to that effect. But you've got That's a Good One, the aforementioned Metropolis Part 1, and songs like Learning to Live, Wait for Sleep, and I think what may be my other favorite Dream Theater song, Under a Glass Moon, is on here. Their follow-up album, Awake, was almost as good, and I've kind of fallen off since then, especially after Metropolis Part 2. But Images and Words, Awake, and Metropolis Part 2 will always be staples in my collection. And moving even further back in time, how many of you were there when the whole grunge thing hit? You had Nirvana with Nevermind, Pearl Jam with 10, Soundgarden with Bad Motorfinger, and shortly after all these albums were released along with Alice in Chains' Dirt, this one kind of popped up out of nowhere. And that would be my number 3 pick, which is Core by Stone Temple Pilots. The one that first broke them big with the song Plush. And it also spawned a string of hits for them. There was Sex Type Thing, Wicked Garden, Creep, all excellent songs. I'm also fond of Cracker Man, and just the whole album's solid. Fun fact, they were actually the first real concert I ever got to see was Stone Temple Pilots and the Butthole Surfers, and they were touring for this album at the time. Now, I don't think that plays into my love of the album because, I had listened to it to death before they even came around that year. But that was a really good show, and unfortunately I didn't get to see them again until 2015. No, not 2015, it was 2012, I think. It was when they were touring for what ended up being their last album. But yeah, very solid release. Alright, we're up into the top 2 now. Now, in the early 90s, I was hanging out with a friend of mine named Chris and a friend of mine named Steve. Both of them were really into metal at the time. And it's about 1992 I heard the first song off of the Megadeth album, Countdown to Extinction. You know, it was good, and I liked Countdown enough to buy it, but then Chris introduced me to this album, and that would be, here we go, Rust in Peace, also by Megadeth. And this was an album I initially didn't give a chance to. I liked the song Hangar 18, didn't really listen to it much beyond then. And I was looking through my CDs one day and needed a little extra cash, and it's like, well, maybe I'll take a few down and trade them in. And I decided to call the record store I went to all the time and see if they'd take the CDs I wanted to go ahead and sell. When I got to this one, guy's like, no, I've already got like 15 copies of that. So I'm like, well, never mind. You know, maybe I should actually listen to it. And by the time the album was over, I was kicking myself for even thinking about getting rid of it. It was so much better than Countdown. And I swear every track on here was great. So everything from the opening Holy Wars all the way through Rust in Peace Polaris. And of course you get songs like Dawn Patrol, Five Magics, Lucretia, and Hangar 18, which had a really cool video too. But yeah, this has not left my collection since, and it never will. So, and finally we've reached number 1. And you figure, well, if I listed Megadeth, these guys probably weren't far behind. And you'd be correct. It is Metallica with Master of Puppets. Now, everyone, well, mostly everyone that I knew got on board with Metallica when the Black Album came out. With the exception of a few people, one of which was my friend TJ. He actually introduced me to this album about a year or so before the Black Album came out. And I really liked what I heard. I think I was in 10th or 11th grade at the time. I was like, this is great. So many good songs on here. You've got really awesome Orions on here. You've got Damage Incorporated, the title track, and probably my favorite song on the entire album, which should come as no surprise, is Welcome Home Sanitarium. But yeah, all in all, whole thing's solid. And in fact, when I met my friend Bob, a year or two later, he started to get into Metallica, and I was like, oh, well, so you've heard the Black Album, you need to hear this. And I ended up putting this album on for him. That pretty much sold him on the band. To my knowledge, he's still a Metallica fan. I've dropped off of them a bit. You know, the Load, Reload era was kind of rough, but not terrible. Then Saint Anger was just... my friend Ryan would have a lot to say about that, but he's not here, so I didn't like Saint Anger. Not many people did, to my knowledge. And then, you know, they did Death Magnetic and Hardwired to Self-Destruct in their new album, 72 Seasons, all of which have been decent, but nothing ever quite got back up to the level of Master of Puppets, not even the follow-up And Justice for All, or the one before that, Ride the Lightning, which, again, are very solid albums. We'll save the discussion about And Justice for All and what they did to Jason Newsted's bass during the mix for another time, if that ever comes. But anyway, there you have it. That would be my top 10 albums that I've listened to the most, excluding the bands I mentioned before. If I ever do a sequel to this, I probably will go ahead and list them. But I wanted to do this one first. So, Joe, if you're checking this out, hope you enjoy it. Anyway, this has been Dyer, and next time you'll hear from me will be on the Dyer and Betty channel. So, everybody have a fun.